Luke sat on the edge of his bed, his fingers intertwined over his bent knees. The afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, but he barely felt the light. His heart beat so loudly that it seemed to echo in his head, a clear sound of dread and hope. In front of him the door to his room was closed, and he knew that on the other side his parents were waiting for him. The moment he had feared for so long was about to happen. He was only 14 years old, but he already carried the weight of a secret that could change everything. Throughout his life, he had always known that something inside him wasn't like what his parents expected. He had never felt attracted to the girls at school like his friends talked about. They would talk about crushes, about kisses and relationships, but Luke always felt disconnected, like he was watching a scene where he had no role to play. But he knew, and it was no longer possible to deny it. He liked boys, and the truth was simple and terrifying at the same time. He was gay. It was a hot Saturday afternoon, and he had spent the whole day rehearsing the words in his mind. "Mom, Dad, I need to talk to you about something." But the words never came out as he wanted. His heart raced in the rhythm of a sad, hasty song, and he wondered if it was possible to hide any longer. The lie he lived was a heavier burden each day, and he knew he had to tell the truth, or it would destroy him from the inside out. So he went to the living room where his parents were sitting on the couch, watching some TV show. The silence between them was dense, as if they already knew something was about to change. "Luke, what's wrong? You look pale," his mother said, looking at him with a worried expression. His father, sitting next to her, just watched him silently, arms crossed. Luke could feel his father's gaze, an expectation that made him feel even smaller. He took a deep breath, trying to organize his words, but he didn't know where to begin. The fear paralyzed him. "Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something." "Something important," he said, finally breaking the silence. His mother's eyes narrowed. "You know you can tell us anything, son. What's going on?" He swallowed hard. "I'm gay." The silence took over the room, like a thick cloud blocking all the light. His father didn't move a muscle. His mother stared at him, trying to process the words that had just come out of his mouth. It was as if she didn't fully understand what she had just heard. "You what?" his mother asked, her voice trembling. Luke felt his stomach tighten. "I'm gay, Mom. I like boys." The silence stretched again until Luke's father finally broke the calm, his voice cold and controlled. "No, son, that's not how things work. This isn't right," he said with a tone of disapproval that made Luke shrink. "But I am this way, Dad," Luke replied, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. His mother seemed in shock, but it was Luke's father who reacted most strongly. "This is a phase. You'll grow out of it. We don't need this here in our house. Life is hard enough, and this will just complicate things further." Luke didn't know what to do with those words. He knew that for his conservative parents, the idea of having a gay son was incomprehensible. It was a reality that didn't fit their beliefs. For them, it wasn't just a phase, it was something wrong, something that needed to be fixed. Their gaze was a mixture of confusion and shame. They were disappointed, and that hurt more than anything he had ever experienced. His mother got up, unsure of how to react, and began pacing the room. She seemed restless, searching for words she couldn't find. Luke felt a wave of guilt wash over him. Should he have done this? Should he have lied a little longer, hidden this part of himself forever? Luke, you have to understand, this isn't something acceptable for us. This isn't who you are. We'll seek help, maybe a therapist. Someone who can help you understand this better, his father said, trying to remain calm but with a firmness that sounded like a sentence. Luke wanted to scream. He wanted to lash out, but he couldn't. He felt powerless. What could he say now? What could he do? He just wanted to be accepted, but he knew that at that moment it seemed impossible. Please, I don't need help, Dad, Luke said, his voice faltering. I just need you to accept me. That's all. His mother stopped and looked at him. Her face was a mix of sadness and confusion. I don't know what to say, son. This is a lot for us. We weren't prepared for this. Luke felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The pain of seeing his parents so distant, so disillusioned, cut deep. He didn't know what more he could say to make them understand that what he felt was real, that he wasn't lying. It wasn't a phase. But in that moment, he realized that nothing else mattered. He had told the truth, and that was a small step. Even if the world fell apart around him, he had finally said what needed to be said. He stood up, moving away from his parents, walking towards the door of the house, not knowing exactly where he would go. But one thing he knew, no matter what happened, he wouldn't be a prisoner of his own lie anymore. Luke left the house without saying another word. His parents' voices echoed in his mind, but the silence inside of him was even louder. He needed to escape, needed to breathe. It felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders, pressing down so hard he could barely walk. His feet carried him to the small park near their house, the one he'd always used as a sanctuary whenever he needed time to think. The sky had begun to darken, the cool air settling in as the evening approached. He sat on one of the benches, his hands trembling in his lap. He had told them. He had done the hardest part, but now he was facing something he had never imagined: rejection. He had always known that his parents were strict, that they had their own ideas about how life should be. They had talked about marriage, children, and the future in a way that always excluded the possibility of something different. But he had hoped, even just a little, that they would accept him. He had hoped that, at the very least, they would try to understand. But now he realized he had been foolish. His parents couldn't accept it. They couldn't accept him. Luke's mind spun in circles, replaying the conversation over and over again. His father's words echoed in his head. This is a phase, you'll grow out of it. His mother's blank stare, like she couldn't comprehend what had just happened. The disappointment in their eyes made him feel like he wasn't their son anymore. It made him feel invisible, like he had ceased to exist in their world. He wanted to cry. He wanted to scream at the injustice of it all, but no tears came. He was numb, and in that numbness he realized something deeper. It wasn't just about his parents not accepting him. It was about the pain of realizing that his truth had shattered everything they believed in, that his identity had the power to break apart the world they had carefully built around him. In the midst of his overwhelming emotions, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his best friend, Jake. "Hey man, you okay? You're acting weird today." Luke stared at the screen for a moment. Jake, his friend who had always been there, who had always supported him without question. He knew Jake would understand. He wanted to talk to Jake, to tell him everything, but the words were stuck in his throat. What could he say? How could he explain what had just happened? Instead of replying, Luke put the phone back in his pocket and buried his face in his hands. The loneliness in that moment was suffocating. He had no one to turn to, no one who would truly understand what he was going through. His parents had shut him out, and his friends. He wasn't sure they would be able to accept him either. His whole world felt like it was falling apart, piece by piece. But then, out of nowhere, he remembered something. A memory that had been buried beneath the surface for so long. It was his grandmother, the one person in his life who had always been kind to him, the one person who had never judged him. When he was younger, she had always said that no matter what happened, no matter who he became, she would love him. She had been his refuge, the one person who could make him feel like he mattered. Luke's heart swelled at the thought of her. She had passed away a year ago, but in that moment he could almost hear her voice. He remembered her warm smile, the way she would take his hand and tell him that life was hard, but that it was always worth living for the people you loved. Maybe, just maybe, she would have been the one to understand him now. Maybe she would have told him that everything was going to be okay, but that wasn't the world he lived in now. His world was filled with rejection, confusion, and pain, and there was no one there to help him through it. His phone buzzed again. This time it was his mother. Luke stared at the message, not sure if he was ready to face her yet. "Luke, we need to talk. Please come home. We're sorry, but we need to understand what you're going through." He stared at the screen for a long time. He didn't know what to think. His parents had rejected him so completely, but now they were asking to talk. Was this some kind of trick? Were they just trying to convince him to change? The fear rose in his chest again. The fear that everything would fall apart if he didn't say the right thing. But deep down, he knew that he couldn't keep hiding from this. He couldn't keep running away. He had to go back home. Luke stood up from the bench and started walking, not sure if he was making the right decision, but knowing that at some point he would have to face them. He didn't know what the conversation would be like. He didn't know what would happen when he walked back through that door. But he knew that at the very least it would be a chance to understand each other, a chance to find some kind of resolution, no matter how difficult it might be. As he walked back home, the weight of the world felt a little lighter. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the beginning of something new, something better, or maybe it would be the end. Either way, he was ready to face it. Luke arrived home, the familiar house looming before him like a fortress, its walls closing in as if they knew what was about to happen. His hands were clammy, his heart pounding, but he didn't hesitate as he stepped onto the porch and reached for the door handle. He couldn't help but think back to that morning, to the way everything had felt so normal just a few hours ago. He had woken up, eaten breakfast, and talked to his parents like they were any other day. Now everything had changed. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, and all it would take was one more step to send him tumbling into the unknown. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and his parents were waiting for him in the living room. They looked almost nervous. His mother sat on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and his father was pacing back and forth, clearly agitated. Neither of them said anything when Luke entered, but they both looked at him with a mix of worry and something else, something he couldn't quite place. Luke stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The silence was unbearable. The weight of everything they had just said was still heavy on his chest, and he wasn't sure if he could face it again. Finally, his father spoke. "Luke," he began, his voice quieter than usual, "we've been talking. We need to understand. We're trying, okay? We're trying to make sense of this." Luke nodded, his throat dry. He wanted to scream at them, to demand that they understand right away, but he held it in. He knew this wasn't the time for that. He had to listen. He had to give them a chance. His mother looked at him with a softness in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. "We don't want to lose you." "Luke," she said gently, "we don't understand. But we're trying." Luke's eyes burned with unshed tears, but he refused to cry, not in front of them. He wasn't sure if it was the hope that they were really trying, or if it was the relief that they hadn't completely shut him out, but something inside of him started to crack. Maybe they weren't as lost to him as he had thought. His father stopped pacing and sat down next to his mother. "You're our son. We just don't know what this means. We're scared, Luke. We're scared of what this will do to you, to your future." That was the moment the reality hit Luke. They weren't rejecting him because they hated him. They were rejecting the idea of a future they hadn't prepared for. They were afraid of what would happen to him in a world that wasn't always kind to people like him. They were afraid of the consequences. "I'm still me," Luke said, his voice shaky but firm. "I'm still your son. I'm still the same person. Nothing has changed except the fact that I'm telling you the truth." His father didn't say anything at first, his face contorted in thought. Then, with a deep sigh, he turned to Luke and spoke in a quieter tone. "But what if you're wrong? What if this phase, as we thought it was, is something you'll regret later?" Luke's heart twisted. He had heard that line before so many times from so many people. He had hoped his parents would be different. He had hoped they would understand that this wasn't something he could just turn off, that it wasn't something that could be wished away. But now, sitting across from them, he realized that they were stuck in their own fear. They couldn't see beyond their own limited understanding of who he was. "Dad," Luke said, his voice more forceful now, "I'm not asking for your approval. I'm asking for your love. You don't have to understand everything, but you have to know that I'm not going to change who I am. I can't." There was a long pause. His mother bit her lip, her gaze fixed on the floor, and his father's face soft, but only slightly. He took a deep breath and looked up at Luke, his expression conflicted. "You're right," his father said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand, but that doesn't mean I don't love you. It doesn't mean I don't care about you. I just don't know how to help you. I don't know how to protect you in a world that might hurt you." Luke swallowed hard. "I don't need you to protect me, Dad. I just need you to be there." The words hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. His father looked at him for a long time, as if considering something. Finally his mother spoke up. "You're still our son," she said quietly, "and we're still your parents. We're not going to turn our backs on you. We just need time. We need time to figure this out, but we're going to try. We promise." For the first time that evening, Luke felt the faintest glimmer of hope. It wasn't everything he wanted. It wasn't the perfect acceptance he had dreamed of, but it was a start. It was something. His father stood up and extended his hand, not as an apology, but as an offering, a gesture of reconciliation. Luke hesitated for a moment, then reached out, grasping his father's hand. And in that moment, something shifted. The wall between them wasn't gone, but it was no longer impenetrable. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to bridge the gap between their different worlds. Luke took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. This was just the beginning, but at least it was a beginning. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The days that followed were a quiet kind of chaos. Luke felt like he was walking on a tightrope, careful with every word he spoke, every move he made. The air in the house was different now, charged with a mixture of tension and tentative hope. He knew his parents were trying, but they were also struggling, each of them grappling with their own fears and misunderstandings. And Luke, despite his bravery in coming out to them, was struggling too. He hadn't expected everything to be fixed overnight, but the awkward silences, the questions they still couldn't bring themselves to ask, were a constant reminder that things were far from easy. It wasn't until that Saturday afternoon, when Luke was sitting in his room, staring at his phone, that the conversation finally took a different turn. His father knocked lightly on his door, and when Luke called out, "Come in," he entered hesitantly, a cup of coffee in hand. "Hey," his father said, sitting down at the edge of the bed, still holding the coffee as if it were an anchor. "Hey," Luke replied, sitting up straighter, unsure of what this moment meant. His father looked at him for a long time, then set the coffee on the knitstand and faced him directly. There was something different in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before, a softness mixed with something like resolve. "I've been thinking about what you said," his father began, his voice steady, but not without a hint of uncertainty, "about how this isn't a phase, and how you can't change who you are." Luke nodded, his heart pounding a little faster. He didn't know where this was going, but he had learned by now to be patient with his father's process. He could see the wheels turning in his mind, and for the first time he wasn't sure what to expect. His father took a deep breath before continuing. "I don't know how to be the father you need. But I know I don't want to be the kind of man who turns his back on his son just because I don't understand everything. I don't know if I'll ever understand fully, but I do know this. You're still my son, Luke, and I'm still your father." Luke's throat tightened at his father's words. There was no grand declaration, no over-the-top promises of full acceptance, but it was enough. It was the beginning of the bridge he had hoped for, a bridge built on trust and the desire to try. "Thanks, Dad," Luke whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." For a moment, neither of them said anything. They just sat there, the silence between them filled with everything they hadn't been able to say up until now. Luke wasn't sure if it was the relief of hearing his father's words or the exhaustion of the past few days, but his chest felt lighter, the tightness that had been there since he first came out beginning to loosen. Then, as if a weight had been lifted, Luke's father spoke again, this time with a small, hesitant smile. "So, what's the plan, huh? How do we get through this?" Luke blinked in surprise. The question seemed so ordinary, yet it was more profound than anything else his father could have said. It was a question of moving forward, a question of how they could rebuild their relationship step by step, without pretending everything would be perfect immediately. Luke smiled faintly. "Well, I think we take it one day at a time." His father chuckled softly. "Sounds like a plan. I think I can manage that." For the first time since this all began, Luke felt like they were on the same page. His father wasn't perfect, and Luke wasn't asking for perfection. But what mattered now was that they were both trying, in their own way, to understand one another. Underscore, the rest of the weekend passed by slowly. Luke spent most of his time in his room, letting his mind wander. His mother, too, was making an effort, but there was still that same distance between them, the unspoken words hanging in the air. She wasn't ready to have the same conversation that his father had started, but he could see the subtle changes. She wasn't glaring at him in the same way anymore. Instead, she was looking at him with an expression that seemed to say, "I'm trying." By Sunday evening, when dinner was on the table, the house had an air of tentative normalcy. It wasn't perfect, but they were all learning how to navigate this new reality. The conversation at the table was light, a welcome break from the heaviness of the past few days. Luke didn't have to answer any hard questions, and that was a relief, for now he was allowed to just be. His father, after a long pause, cleared his throat. "We were talking," he began, looking at Luke with a touch of nervousness. "About your boyfriend." Luke froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. The mention of Aaron was sudden, unexpected, and Luke's mind raced. Had they been talking about him? Did they already know about Aaron, or were they just trying to take the next step? His mother looked at him, her gaze gentle but searching. "We want to know who he is, Luke, if you're ready to talk about him." It took a moment for Luke to process the request. His parents weren't demanding an immediate answer, but the fact that they were asking felt like a monumental shift. He put his fork down and sighed. This was it, the next step. He could either shut them out again or let them in. I'd like you to meet him," Luke said, his voice more confident than he felt. "But I need to be sure that you're really ready." His father nodded, a small but meaningful gesture. "We're ready, Luke. We're just taking it slow, that's all." And for the first time in his life, Luke didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He felt lighter, the burden of fear lifting, replaced by the tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, his family could be everything he needed them to be. The days after that Sunday dinner felt like a slow march toward something Luke could barely define. His parents' willingness to listen, to acknowledge his truth, had planted a seed of hope in him. It wasn't that they were suddenly perfect, that everything had changed overnight. It was more that, for the first time, he could see the possibility of a future where they could be part of his life as his true self. But there were still challenges ahead, and there was one that Luke knew would be the hardest. The next weekend, Luke decided it was time. Aaron had been waiting patiently for this moment, too, and now that his parents were starting to come around, Luke knew it was the right time to introduce them to the boy who had become his rock. He hadn't been sure how to prepare Aaron for this moment, or whether he even could, but it felt like a necessary step. When Aaron arrived that Saturday afternoon, Luke's heart raced. The idea of opening his world up to his parents was terrifying. There was always the chance they might not understand, that they might push him away, or worse, push Aaron away. But something about his father's words, that small shift, made him feel like they could handle this. Aaron stood in the doorway, his hands nervously clutching the straps of his backpack, looking for all the world like a boy about to step into a lion's den. Luke grinned weakly, stepping forward and giving him a quick hug. "You're okay," Luke whispered. More to himself than to Aaron. "It'll be fine." Right, Aaron said, his voice tight but determined. You said they're trying? Luke nodded. They are. Just follow my lead. They entered the living room where Luke's parents were sitting, Luke's father reading a book and his mother flipping through a magazine. When they both looked up, Aaron froze for a moment, as if taking a mental inventory of what he was walking into. Luke gave his hand a reassuring squeeze before he spoke. Mom, Dad, this is Aaron, Luke said, the words coming out in a rush, as though he could get them out faster and avoid the heavy pause that followed. He's my boyfriend. His mother's eyebrows lifted in surprise, and his father set his book down, his expression unreadable. Luke felt a lump rise in his throat, but he pushed it down. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. For a long moment no one spoke. The tension in the room was palpable. Luke's heart was hammering in his chest as his parents exchanged a look. They weren't shocked. They'd had time to process this, to come to terms with their son's truth. But that didn't mean they weren't still grappling with it. Luke's father was the first to speak. So, Aaron, he said, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of curiosity. How long have you two been? About a year, Aaron said, his voice a little shaky but sincere. He held his ground, his eyes meeting both of Luke's parents. We've been through a lot together, and, well, I care about Luke a lot. Luke's mother nodded slowly, her gaze moving from Aaron to Luke, then back to Aaron again. She opened her mouth, then closed it, like she wasn't quite sure what to say. After a moment, she simply said, "Thank you for being honest with us." Luke's heart caught in his throat. Those words, so simple, yet they meant more than he could express. His mother wasn't rushing to say it was all okay, but she was acknowledging the truth, and that was more than enough. It was his father who finally spoke again. "I won't pretend to understand everything," he said, his voice softer now, "but I know that Luke's happiness matters. And if you're part of that, then I'll do my best to make this work. All I ask is that you both respect this house, okay?" Luke's eyes went wide. He hadn't expected it to go so smoothly. He had been bracing for a confrontation, for something more dramatic, but instead, his father's words were calm, level-headed, and honest. His mother nodded in agreement, her expression no longer distant, but open. Luke felt like he could breathe again. The weight that had been pressing down on him for weeks was beginning to lift, and in its place there was the warmth of something new and understanding that didn't yet have a clear shape, but was no less real for it. "Of course," Aaron said, his voice steady now that the worst was over. He smiled at Luke, a soft, almost hesitant smile, before looking back at his parents. "We'll respect your house. Thank you for letting us be here." The conversation shifted after that, and what followed was a simple, awkward dinner. But for Luke, it felt like a miracle. There was still a lot to talk about, a lot to navigate, but this moment, this acceptance, was everything. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. Over the following weeks, the tentative calm that had settled over the house started to feel more natural. Luke's parents, while still processing everything in their own ways, began making small gestures that showed they were willing to be a part of Luke's life as he was. His father would occasionally ask about Aaron, not in an overly intrusive way, but as if trying to understand what their relationship meant. His mother, though she still had moments of hesitation, would smile whenever Aaron came over and offer polite conversation. her way of acknowledging that she was trying. 2. One evening, Luke's father surprised him by asking if Aaron wanted to join them for a family barbecue. It wasn't much, but to Luke, it was a signalless sign that his father wasn't just tolerating his relationship. He was beginning to accept it, in his own time and his own way. And for Luke, that was more than he could have asked for. The road ahead wasn't always smooth. There were still moments when his parents' old beliefs reared their heads, moments when the weight of their conservatism seemed to weigh too heavily on them. But Luke held on to the knowledge that they were trying, and that meant everything. As time passed, the atmosphere at home continued to shift. Luke's parents may not have had all the answers, but they were beginning to understand the most important truth, that love wasn't defined by anything other than the people who shared it, and for Luke, that was more than enough. He didn't need them to have all the answers. Not yet. He just needed them to be willing to walk alongside him as he continued to discover who he was and who he wanted to love. Months passed, and the awkwardness that initially filled the house had slowly evolved into something much more comfortable. Luke's parents were trying, and though they weren't always successful in understanding everything about him, there was one thing they could not deny: their son was happier. He smiled more, laughed louder, and no longer felt the weight of hiding who he truly was. But despite the progress, there were moments when the tension resurfaced. It wasn't that Luke's parents didn't want to accept him. They were simply struggling with years of ingrained beliefs that didn't vanish overnight. Every time they made an effort, there was always a silent hesitation, like they were trying to reconcile their values with the love they felt for their son. One night after Aaron had left the house, Luke found his father sitting alone in the living room. His eyes were fixed on the TV, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. Luke hesitated at the doorframe before walking in, unsure of how to approach him. He knew his father wasn't an openly emotional man, and he didn't expect him to suddenly become one. But there was something about the silence in the room that felt heavy, like there was more to say. "Dad," Luke said softly. His father turned his head, startled, as if he hadn't heard Luke approach. "Hey, Luke," he said, his voice flat but warm enough. Luke stood in the doorway, feeling the weight of the moment. "You've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" There was a